All right, so we now come to the main part of our program. We've been looking forward to this. This actually in context of last week's conversation with Ken Zeff about public school system and how there are certain parts of the public school system that are being, the students there are being seriously left behind, including the families. And today's conversation will be a follow-on to that, but from a little bit different angle. So I'm going to turn it over to our program chair, Bill Henagan, who will introduce our speaker and I think do a little moderation as well. So thank you, Bill, and you take it over from here.
Thank you, Cannon. And this is a content-rich program today, and a lot of thoughtful content by a lot of very seasoned veterans. Leave your comments on how you like these programs, and any programs you want to see, please leave them in the notes. Today, we're honored and delighted to have Dr. Beverly Tatum with us. She's been an Atlanta Rotary Club member since 2003, and she's the president emerita of Spellman College and currently a New York Times best-selling author. Beverly's been a key leader over the last 15 years in evolving Spellman to be one of the best liberal arts colleges in the country. Some of the initiatives she engaged was she created a Center for Leadership and Civic Engagement at Spellman. She initiated a Going Global program, which was a campus-wide philosophy on increased global engagement and exposure. As a commitment to the environment, as she rebuilt most of the campus, best I can tell, she insisted on LEED and gold and silver ratings on all the buildings. She also inspired a wellness revolution that launched a holistic approach to empowering and educating Spellman women for the lifelong health and wellness. And of course, like every revered president, she raised more money than any of the other college presidents in the history of the college. For all you capital campaign folks out there, imagine if 71% of your alumni made a gift during your capital campaign. That's pretty impressive stuff. In 2013, she was awarded the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award. In 2014, she was awarded the Outstanding Lifetime Contribution to Psychology, which is the highest honor presented by the APA. And in 2005, she was the Brock International Prize winner in Education for Innovation. Since she's been retired, and it doesn't sound like she's been retired, she's the chairman of the board of the Westside Future Fund. She's member of the board of Georgia Power, Educational Testing, Smith College, Morehouse College, and the Tull Charitable Foundation, just to name a few. And to top that, she's been on a book tour for the last couple of years, discussing her revised book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and other conversations about race. She's a nationally recognized thought leader on race relations, a topic she's been studying, teaching, and writing about for the past 40 years. So Beverly, thank you for being on the program today, and congratulations on your book. My research says it was a must-read in 1997, and then now it's a New York Times bestseller for the last, 6 weeks? 7 weeks?
6, yeah.
Excellent, excellent work. Well, we're delighted to have you. But let's just jump right into the content. You and I have had a couple of conversations about this, and thank you for the conversations up to now. To talk intelligently about race, it's hard. And your book has a thoughtful, nuanced style I found very approachable. So I wanted to start off by asking you, how do we have this conversation to begin with in our daily lives, whether we're in our companies, at Rotary, or even one-on-one? And then when we're having it, why does it feel so difficult?
Well, first, let me thank you for that warm introduction, Bill. And I want to actually start with why it's hard. And then we can talk about how we get over the hardness of that. One of the things that I've learned, both from my teaching experience, I taught a course on the psychology of racism for close to 20 years before becoming president of Spellman. And in the various lectures I've given around the country, I always like to start by asking people to think about their earliest race-related memory. And I know, the audience can't raise their hands in this context, in this online context, but if we were all together at the Loudermilk Center, we might ask that question. And my guess is most people would say they do have an early memory, something that they remember from childhood that was race-related. And if we were to ask people how old they were at the time of that memory, most people will tell you that it goes back to school age, maybe early kindergarten, first grade, second grade, maybe 5, 6, 7 years old. And then if you ask, well, what emotion is attached to it? most people will tell you some feeling of discomfort, maybe fear, maybe anger, maybe embarrassment, maybe shame, maybe guilt. Of course, sometimes it's a warm feeling like friendship or love connected to a caring relationship. But for most people, it's an uncomfortable feeling. And then if you ask, okay, well, thinking about that situation, did you talk to anybody about it? Did you talk to a parent or a teacher, someone at the time who might have been able to help you as a young person figure out what was going on? Most people will tell you they didn't. And that's pretty interesting, particularly if we think about the 5, 6, 7-year-olds we know. They tend to be pretty candid. They don't filter much. So if you've got a young child who's got an early experience attached to an uncomfortable feeling, who has already at the age of 6 or 7 learned they're not supposed to talk about this thing, that there's silence around it, that conveys a very important lesson, which gets repeated over time. Many people will say, you know, it wasn't just then. I learned growing up that I wasn't supposed to talk about race, particularly in a racially mixed setting. And so now, fast forward to our adult years, we have a lot of reminders in our environment that this is not something we're supposed to talk about. And for that reason, many people are uncomfortable even raising the topic. But if we wanted to do that, and now is a good time given what's going on in our country, if we wanted to have that conversation, it helps to just acknowledge that it's awkward and uncomfortable for everyone. It's not just you feeling that. And to say, you know, I think we should be having these conversations, and I know it's uncomfortable, but let's try to make that leap anyway.
Thank you. That helps a lot. That it's not just me. That
Yeah.
it is relatively hard. But you know, one of the things you talk about in your book a lot, and it makes complete sense, is the language gap, and how it's harder to have the conversation if we're all using different language for different topics. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. There's a whole chapter at the early part of my book in which I define terms. And one of the reasons I think that's important is because a lot of times people are talking past each other because they're using the same words, but they're not meaning the same things. So what can we say about that? One of the things that I say is that, for example, prejudice and racism, those are two words that people use a lot, and some people consider them to be interchangeable, but they aren't really. Prejudice speaks to individual attitudes that are often based on limited information, sometimes based on stereotypes we've learned as kids growing up. And what's important to say about that is, though many people will tell you they don't have a prejudice bone in their body, the fact is we all are exposed to misinformation about people different from ourselves. I like to say it's kind of like breathing smog. If you live in a smoggy place, you're going to be a smog breather. Nobody wants to describe themselves that way. It's not an attractive description. But if we understand that we've all been exposed to stereotypes about other people, misinformation about people we didn't grow up around, we are likely to have some smog in our system, right? We're likely to have some of those attitudes. But racism is more than just individual attitudes. Racism is a system. It's systemic, it's structural, it's policies and practices that work together that systematically advantage, in the case of our society, US, systematically advantage white people, systematically disadvantage people of color. And those systems are operating even when we ourselves are not actively participating. You don't have to have active, well-intentioned, well-believed prejudices to be participating in systems that are systematically advantaging one group over another. And that's part of the challenge, because sometimes we think of racism as just individual acts of meanness, and you can be perfectly kind and gracious to people and still be reinforcing racist policies and practices, sometimes even without your full awareness.
Good thoughts. So along on that, if we extend that, you know, we like to believe we live in a meritocracy in America, that, you know, rags to riches stories, Horatio Alger stories. We believe in an exceptionalism, you know, a la Elon Musk or Teddy Roosevelt, and then and really in a democracy where majority rules. In your book, you pretty much blew up those as myths for most of the population. As you discussed, white privilege, white advantage, and the nuance associated with each. Would you expand on that here for us?
Sure. You know, as you're asking me this question, I think that there's something I want to expand on a little bit before I get to this question. And that has to do with this idea of, I was talking about this system, racism as a system. And in order to really understand the concept of privilege, the way people use it in that term, white privilege, we have to really, I want to deepen for a moment our understanding of that system. And I want to say about it is that those policies, those practices, those institutional systems that were well established before any one of us in this room, in the sound of my voice. You know, I was born in 1954. In 1954, those systems were in place. If you're of the same generation as I am, we didn't create those systems. They were existing when we showed up on the planet. And that system is kind of like a conveyor belt. I like to use the analogy of the moving walkway at the airport, you know, where it's like you're born into the society, you step onto that system, you get carried along by it. And you don't really have to do much to get carried along. If we use that image of the moving walkway at the airport, you know, when I'm going to the airport, I'm usually trying to get from one terminal to the next, and I walk fast on that moving walkway. If we think about people who are walking fast on the moving walkway of racism, we might think of those people who are actively embracing attitudes of white supremacy. You know, people who are clearly articulating, you know, active segregationists, for example, moving fast on that walkway, trying to get where that cycle of racism is taking us. But there are other people who are just standing still, not in a hurry, just standing still, but they're still being carried along. They're still being carried along in their passivity. They don't have to do anything, but it's still being carried along. If we want to interrupt that cycle, if we don't want to see where that cycle is going, we have to turn around. But if we turn around, unless we're actively moving, we're still traveling where the cycle is taking us. We're just traveling backwards, where we don't know, we don't see where we're headed, but we're still going in that direction. So when we talk about interrupting racism, we have to talk about it as an active process. We hear the phrase in today's news a lot, anti-racist. What does that mean? It means we're actively walking against the cycle. We're actively walking to interrupt those policies and practices. So now to get to your question about, you know, meritocracy, the myth of the meritocracy is one of the things I talk about in the book. We all have grown up one of the characteristics of US culture is this focus on individual effort, and, you know, that people get what they deserve, and we work hard and we get rewards, and people who have gotten ahead in society have gotten there because they've worked hard. And this is not to say they didn't work hard, but we also have to acknowledge that there are systems in place that make it easier for some people, more difficult for others, and that is defined by the history of racism in our society, as just one example. So what do I mean by that? I think for our Rotarians, we might use as an example the GI Bill, right? Because, you know, certainly there are a lot of veterans in our chapter, and many of us grew up in families where our parents served in the military. You know, I said I was born in 54. My dad was a World War II era veteran. But if we look at the benefits that the GI Bill provided, many people will point to the GI Bill in terms of access to education and low interest housing loans as really the foundation of the middle class in the United States. Many people were able to enter the middle class, buy their own homes because of those low interest loans. Many people were able to advance economically because they had access to education loans. But if you look at how that GI Bill was administered, the original GI Bill ended in 1956. 8 million World War II veterans received education and training as a result of the GI Bill. 4.3 million loans, guaranteed loans for houses, low-income housing, $33 billion worth of loans were given out as a result of that original GI Bill. But if you look at how those benefits were administered, they were not administered federally, they were administered by states. And the same policies and practices, the segregationist policies and practices that were in place in the states in the 1950s prevented many Black veterans from benefiting from those GI Bills. They couldn't go to many of the flagship institutions because those were segregated institutions, white only. If they were able to access college education, they had to go to an HBCU. And nothing wrong with going to an HBCU, except those institutions had limited number of seats. So a lot of folks were overwhelmed by the demand. Many people who might have liked to go to college couldn't get in to one of those institutions and didn't have access to the whites only institutions. If we look at housing, it's really dramatic to see how policies and practices around redlining, for example, literally red lines drawn around certain neighborhoods because they were Black majority neighborhoods, couldn't get loans to buy houses in those neighborhoods, couldn't get loans to buy into the new suburbs that were being built all around the country because they were whites only. And I want to just use one statistic because I think it's pretty shocking. If you look in the South, right, in Mississippi, for example, of the 3,200 guaranteed home loans that were made available during this time period, only 2 went to Black borrowers, Black veterans who were able to qualify, only 2. If you look in the Northeast, New York, Northern New Jersey, 67,000 guaranteed mortgages issued. Less than 100 went to Black borrowers. So when we talk about this, I'd like to lift up this particular historical moment because most people's biggest wealth asset is their home. Being able to buy a house during that time period meant that you could borrow against that house and educate your children. It meant that you could trade up and get a bigger house, as the house appreciated. So the fact that just that data point shows to the ways in which racism systematically advantaged white people, systematically disadvantaged Black people, even in a similar context, all veterans. And that's just one example. So that's kind of what, when we talk about privilege, what we're talking about is what opportunities have you had access to simply because you're white? In today's world, we might even talk about, white privilege. I like to describe it as the benefit of the doubt. If you're a white person running in a white neighborhood, nobody questions whether you belong in that neighborhood. You're getting the benefit of the doubt. But if you're a Black person running in what is perceived as a majority white neighborhood, as Ahmaud Arbery was, maybe you're seen as a threat. Maybe you are at risk, your own personal safety is at risk because you've been perceived in that way. When people are getting privilege, they don't always know it. The person running through that neighborhood isn't thinking, gosh, I'm getting the benefit of the doubt in this neighborhood. But the person who doesn't have it is well aware of it, as Ahmaud Arbery certainly became aware. I hope that's helpful.
That's fascinating. And so for those of us struggling with the conversation, you have another more nuanced conversation that fits under that to me, and it requires some runway. So I grew up with a mom who grew up in Atlanta. Her father grew up in Hancock County in South Georgia. And I promise you, growing up, and I grew up in the same era that you did, we never talked about anything ugly, as she would refer to it. So I can guarantee you we didn't talk about the civil rights movement. We didn't talk about, I'm not sure we talked about the bad weather outside. Life was good in the Buckhead bubble, if you will. And so you have another concept in there called color blind versus color silent.
Yes.
Walk us through how to think about that if you grew up in the Buckhead bubble, for instance.
Sure. Well, it's not just in Buckhead. Around the country, you can talk to many people of our generation and younger. Kids growing up in my children's generation, millennials, who will tell you that they were taught by their parents to be colorblind. And what that means is that they were taught not to make reference. Of course, people notice when someone is dark-skinned or light-skinned, black person, white person. We all notice that. Asian person, we notice these things. But when someone says, I'm colorblind, what they're trying to tell you is, I was taught not to notice or not to say I notice, right? Not to comment on someone's difference. Of course, we all want to be non-discriminatory, right? Nobody wants to be noticed and discriminated against because of their racial group membership. But to say you don't notice means to say you don't notice an important part of somebody's identity. If someone says to me, I don't notice that you're a Black woman, what that means is a big part of how my life is organized by not just the choices I make, but the choices people make for me is being overlooked. So we don't want to be colorblind. To say you're colorblind means you're not noticing an important part of somebody's life experience. But what I think is perhaps more accurate when we say that someone is colorblind, it's not that they don't notice, it's that they've learned not to speak about what they notice. And I use the phrase color silent. And color silence is problematic too, because it means that we can't talk about this problem of race and racism in our society. That kind of goes back to how we started. If I've learned from childhood not to mention these issues, or as you said, your mother said, don't talk about anything ugly or controversial or uncomfortable. We don't want to have those uncomfortable conversations. The problem is you can't solve a problem you can't talk about. So if we say we're not going to discuss race or racism, we're not going to have these awkward or sometimes uncomfortable conversations, we're not going to be able to get to a place where we can actually solve the problem of racism in our society because we are all being silent about it. There's a really interesting survey that I quote in my book, which was done with young people between the ages of 14 and 20. The survey was done by MTV, and it was targeting the millennial or even younger, the post-millennial generation, young people born in the early, late 90s, early 2000s. And one of the questions they were asked was, how have you witnessed bias? 97% of them, almost 100% said, yes, I have witnessed instances of bias. I have witnessed someone being treated differently because of their race or religion or sexual orientation. It wasn't limited only to race, but instances of bias. And then the question was, how comfortable are you talking about the bias? Well, only 20% of them said they felt comfortable having a conversation about it. Almost all had said, yes, I've witnessed it, but I'm afraid to have these conversations. I'm afraid that talking about it will make it worse. And that silence is part of what perpetuates inequality in our society, because we're not willing, too many young people and of our own generation are unwilling to speak up about it.
Thanks. So one thing I want to remind the audience is we have a Q&A feature down at the bottom of the of YouTube, and I know it's a difficult topic, but would love to hear your questions on that. And with that aside, so Beverly, you're the quintessential optimist as a human being, and so are you optimistic about the conversation we're in now?
Well, I think that there is an opportunity. I think the current moment, both because the COVID situation has kept many of us at home, and as a consequence, we are watching TV or online and seeing and learning things that we weren't seeing and learning before. The fact that my book, 23 years after its original publication, is now on the New York Times bestseller list, along with a lot of other books dealing with the topic of race and racism, lets me know that there are a lot of people who are deciding to invest some time in trying to educate themselves and get more understanding around the challenge of racism in our society. So that is encouraging. What I do know, however, is that these conversations, in order to be effective, need to be sustained. So it's not just that, we should have a conversation today and, check that box and move on, but we really need to be able to continue to look at what are the policies, what are the practices in our workplace, what are the conversations taking place in our kids' school, what are the resources that I need to make available to my own family members so that they can be better prepared to think about these questions and be part of the solution, as opposed to reinforcing the cycle of racism that's been operating in our society for so long. So I believe change is possible. I have certainly seen it in my lifetime. And I think that with a concerted effort, we can all move the ball forward in terms of really thinking about how to create more equity in our world and in our city.
That's terrific. So on that line, I want to ask one more question. That I'm a fairly pragmatic person,
Yes.
and I'm gonna read a quote from your book for you.
Okay.
So the book quotes, "If we want to interrupt these cycles, the cycles you were just talking about, we have to be quite intentional about it. Even without any malicious intents, such passive acts of giving in to certain institutions or traditions will perpetuate the system of advantage based on race." So I take that to mean in our day-to-day life, we have to consciously do something different. Not just acknowledge awareness is important, but what are some concrete examples you'd hand us to say, here's some stuff that's easy, or here's some low-hanging fruit, not to make it easy, but here's some low-hanging fruit that you can do in just day-to-day living?
Yeah. Well, I was struck by the conversation we heard from Admiral Mullen just a few weeks ago when he was talking about hiring. And one of the things that he said is that, ducks choose ducks. And certainly we know, for example, that unconscious bias, this is an example of, people might intend to be inclusive in terms of their hiring practices, but what we know is that there's a lot of unconscious bias that manifests itself in hiring practices. Research study after research study shows, for example, that if you have identical resumes given to raters, and one set of resumes has what we might think of as, quote, white names or not racially identifiable names. Like, for example, these are real names used in studies. Greg Baker. That might sound to some people as, could be anybody's name, but you wouldn't necessarily assume that it's a person of color's name in the way that you would if the resume says Jamal Jones. So if you got a resume that one says Greg Baker and the other says Jamal Jones, the rater might assume Jamal Jones is African-American, might assume Greg Baker is white. The Greg Baker resume, even though it's identical, is 50% more likely to get a call back than the Jamal Jones resume. Those studies have been done. Similarly, Emily Walsh, maybe that's a white person, maybe not, but Lakeisha Washington is probably assumed to be Black. Emily Walsh is going to get a 50% more likely call back than Lakeisha Washington, even when the resumes are identical. So what can we do about that? One of the things we could do, of course, is take names off resumes, but that's not the only indicator. Where somebody went to school might give a bias, where someone, but you can say, I want to be sure my applicant pool is diverse. So I'm going to look to see how many candidates of color do I have? How many applicants are in my pipeline? And then I'm going to make sure that I have a representative group in my pool of finalists. And if I've been clear about that expectation, if I've set a threshold of excellence, this is what I'm looking for in terms of what people can do and what experiences they've had. If I've set that threshold, and then anyone who is a person of color who has met that threshold is in my population, it increases the likelihood, for example, that I'm going to be able to increase the diversity of my employee base because I've been intentional about it. Many people struggle with that concept of being intentional in a very specific way, but we do know that it improves the likelihood of expanding opportunity when we are doing that. If we think about, I like to just say, asking the question, who's in this picture and who's missing from it. Let's imagine this. Let's imagine we were in the Loudermilk Center and we took a photo of everyone in Rotary, and everybody got a copy of that photo before they left. The first thing we would all do when we got our copy of the photo is ask, where am I in it? We'd look for ourselves in that picture. But let's imagine that for some reason, all the people of color were digitally removed from the photo. Let's just imagine that. That, of course, would never happen, but let's imagine that. Everybody's been digitally removed. When we got our copy of the photo and we looked for ourselves in it, I wouldn't see myself. You know, John Grant wouldn't see himself because we've been digitally removed from the picture. Some people are regularly removed but are not included in the picture, right? Are more likely to be included than others. So if we, as leaders, if we get in the habit of asking who's missing from the picture, we are more likely to make decisions that make sure that everyone's being included. That seems perhaps very simple, but you'd be surprised how many people are not in the habit of asking who's missing from this picture. And of course, what can I do about it? So if we are focused on trying to expand the inclusion in our daily lives, in our workplaces, in the, you know, who's included in the curriculum, who's included in the classroom, who's included in our organizations, we will find that we start to interrupt the cycle in some very tangible ways. As just one example. There are many others, of course, in my book.
Well, I'll ease up on the hard questions and ask you an easy one. So the looks like the public schools are going to stay virtual for the fall. And we heard from Ken Zeff last week that grace and patience are our watchwords for the fall. As an educator, what should they be doing? What do we do in terms of this conversation, or in terms of how do we keep kids from falling behind?
Well, it's so interesting. One of the things I just recently had a conversation, I won't name any names here, but I just recently had a conversation with a school principal who was talking about her goals to try to bring to, as part of the virtual learning experience, a social justice curriculum so that kids can be helped to think more critically about the issues that have been in the news. You know, how do we talk about racial justice in our classrooms? What are kids learning? Not just about the civil rights era, and we're hearing a lot about the news as it relates to John Lewis's legacy, for example, and C.T. Vivian, but what are kids learn? I mean, so much of my teaching as a college professor was filling in gaps in young people's historical knowledge because they just didn't, you know, all the stuff that happened in, you know, the era of the, you know, during the days of slavery, enslavement, you know, people have a little bit of information about that. And maybe they have a little bit of information about the civil rights era, but there's a lot of missing information that is really important, I think, to really understand not only how we got where we are in terms of race relations, but how we move beyond it. It's very hard to understand where you are in the present if you don't know your history. So thinking about this particular principal was thinking about how was she going to build in more curricular understanding as part of the virtual online learning experience. That's just one set of questions. We do know, as Ken talked about, that a lot of kids are not going to have access to the kind of digital resources they need, maybe bandwidth, for example, maybe even a quiet place to study because of housing challenges. And so thinking about, certainly at the Westside Future Fund, we are thinking about how can we help provide resources in kind of an after school way. You know, what alternative places can kids be, even in a pandemic, where they might have better access to the kind of learning environment they need while they're getting instruction from their teachers. So there are a lot of things that we are thinking about, as well as the fundamentals of food security and, you know, adequate housing and all of the things. When we talk about racial disadvantage and economic disadvantage, of course, they intersect. And we know that if we want to really interrupt the cycle of racism, we have to think about both racial and economic disadvantage.
We've got a question from the floor. in your book, you included all minority groups, not just Black, white, in there.
Yeah.
So, what other minority groups have done well, and is there a different systematic bias that they're getting around or improving that you see?
Yeah. So this is there's probably not enough time for me to go into a lot of detail, but one of the things that we can certainly talk about, right? I write, there's a chapter about the experience of the Latinx population, the experience of Asian Americans, experience of Native or Indigenous peoples, and how that has played itself out, multiracial populations, and the particular challenges of racism that those populations have had to deal with. One of the things that we talk about, and we often hear, for example, Asian Americans as a, quote, model minority. And the myth of the model minority is that what we know from an immigration point of view is that the fastest growing population in the United States is actually the Asian American population. Today, it represents about 6%. We certainly know that there's a long history of anti-Asian attitudes that go back to the time of the Chinese building the railroads in the early in the 19th century, the certainly internment of Japanese Americans, negative attitudes today related to religious perceptions, perceiving Muslim populations in a particular way, for example. But one of the things that's important to acknowledge is that when we look at the immigrant population, particularly since 1965, is the highly educated nature of that, particularly South Asian, but also Chinese, coming into the country, often with resources of education, as opposed to, let's say, the immigrant population coming in from Central and South America, or Central America, Mexico, and other Central American countries, a largely uneducated population. So there's a very interesting study that's talked about in my book that compares the educational attainment of Central Americans in California versus the educational attainment of Asian Americans in California. And what's interesting is that actually the fastest educational attainment is happening in that Central American population because they're going from, virtually no high school education to high school education and college education or college admission in essentially one generation. That's a big leap, right? But if you have even if you're coming as an immigrant with very few dollars in your pocket, but if you're coming with a college education that you got perhaps in your home country, it's no surprise that your kids are going to college, because the best predictor of whether you go to college is whether your parents did, even if they went someplace in a different country. So I think a lot of times when people are comparing outcomes between different populations, racial or ethnic minorities within the United States, they're not really comparing apples and oranges or apples to apples. They're comparing apples and oranges because the historical needs are different. That's just one example, but there's lots more to say about it, which of course why in this updated version of my book, I have much more info in it.
We have barely scratched the surface of your book based on the book that I read. So there's lots more in-depth conversations ahead, and hopefully we'll start to have them at Rotary, because you've given us such a good format and good platform and template to use. Now, one easy question. So what's the difference in the book tour in the COVID era as opposed to the fly anywhere you want era?
Well, I have to say I'm spending a lot of time on Zoom. So
I bet.
But I am getting kind of used to that. So when my book came out, the updated version, 20th anniversary edition, came out in 2017. And I spent a lot of time traveling around speaking about it and, at conferences and on college and university campuses, and was doing that right up until March 2020, when we all started to stay at home. And now I'm finding that those same conference leaders and college and university organizers still want to talk about the book and the issues in it, but now we're doing it over Zoom. So it's easier for me. My husband likes the fact that I'm spending more time at home than in the airport, and I appreciate that too.
Right. We're all getting a lot more used to our family on a day-to-day basis, aren't we?
Indeed.
Well, thank you for your time, and thanks for coming on the program. And Cannon, all yours.
Well, great. And Beverly, don't leave quite yet. You know, what's interesting is once Bill said, fill out the Q&A form, we started getting lit up questions along the way, and we're kind of running to the top of the hour now. So maybe I'll just, I have two questions for you just to wrap. The first one is, what questions should we have asked that we didn't ask? Is there one question that you often get that you wish we had asked in this forum today?
Well, I saw a question in a chat box, so I'll just answer it. And that question, a very common one, is sort of what's different between, 1997 when the book first came out and 2017 when the 20th anniversary edition came out. And I like to talk about it in terms of the 4 Ps. Population, the demographics of our society have changed dramatically. When I was born in 1954, the US population was 90% white, 10% everybody else. If you were born in 1997, or really more, if you were born in the year 2000, if you're a 21st century kid, you are part of a cohort that's now 52% white, 48% everybody else. That's a big shift. And that's reflected in the demographics that I write about in the book. But also, politics have changed. Bill Clinton was president in 97, and then he was followed by George W. Bush, and then he was followed by Barack Obama. And now, of course, we have our current president and Donald Trump. And so if you look at what each of those presidents was saying about the significance of race, in 1997, Bill Clinton was saying, we should be having this conversation. He started something called his Presidential Initiative on Race. Many people don't remember it, but he launched it in 97. And in it, and he said, I think we should be talking about this now because we're at peace. We're a prosperous nation. In 97, people were feeling prosperous, and we're not at war with anyone. But fast forward to today, we're not feeling prosperous and we are at war. And so it's hard to have difficult conversations under stress. And we certainly are under stress right now. So that's changed. And we are also much more polarized. Social media contributes to that. The fact that we're not all watching the same nightly news. Some of us are on Fox, some of us are on MSNBC, some of us are on CNN, and we're hearing different things. That has changed the nature of our conversation. And then finally, psychology has changed. So population, politics, polarization, and the 4th P is psychology. I am a psychologist, and we know some things in psychology today that we didn't know 20 years ago about how unconscious bias operates, about something called stereotype threat, about the ways in which how we view people can shift given what we know about psychology. And so I tried to include that in the book as well.
Well, thoughtful answer. And Bill alluded to it, but just curious then, let me ask another question a different way. Are you optimistic about the future when it comes to race relations and racial injustice and how people are engaging to solve problems in this challenging time?
Well, I like to say when I talk about optimism, I am an optimist by nature. That is part of my personality. But I think it is necessary to maintain hopefulness, because when we don't make change, right? If I tell you, no, there's no hope, right? Well, I'll just go back to what we were doing and say, well, I guess there's nothing to be done about it. So I think I like to think of hopefulness as a discipline. It's something that we have to choose every day. And so if we are choosing to be hopeful, we are choosing to say, change is possible. And I will always choose to say change is possible because I've seen it. I've seen change happen. And I think even when it looks like, things are not going the way we wish they were, change is still possible. And so I will always say, yes, I'm hopeful because I know change can happen if each of us makes the choice to take action. We can certainly make a difference. And the Atlanta Friendship Initiative is just one example of that.
Well, I love your hope. And as our final question, our club has formed a task force on economic and racial injustice, and we're looking to find ways that we can thoughtfully engage and get involved and make a difference. What would, in the coming year, how would you give that committee advice? What would you say might be an area to focus on to make some tangible progress and not try to boil the ocean at the same time?
Yeah, so this is really you want to focus on something that you can really have an impact on. I have been asked on a number of occasions, like if there was one thing, if I could wave a magic wand, what would I do? And I'm going to tell you what I've said then, and I'll say it again. I would focus on ensuring a living wage. So much of our, as I said, racial disadvantage is married with economic disadvantage. And the fact that so many people, we see it in this COVID environment, so many of the essential workers are people who are doing work that is necessary to our society, but who, are going to be evicted in a minute because they aren't earning enough to pay the rents in the city of Atlanta. We need to understand that a living wage is a civil right. People if the work needs to be done, it ought to be able to be done, and you ought to be able to sustain yourself doing it. There are lots of people working full-time jobs who can't live on $20,000 a year. Who in our club could say, I could live on $20,000 a year? Most people can't. We know that. But if you're earning the current minimum wage, that's what you're earning. And so we really need to try to address that, because while it's not specifically race related, there's a direct link between what we might think of as poverty wages, sharecropping, convict leasing, low unsustainable pay. There's a direct link from what we used to in another time refer to as slave wages to what we now call a minimum wage, which is not sustainable.
Well, Beverly, thank you so much for your thoughts. I read your book when it did come out first in 1997, and I took a bunch of notes in it, and I just thought it was so insightful. And then I read the following, the revised edition, and it remains on my bookshelf today. So thank you for engaging with us today on this crucial topic, and one that we'll be certainly working hard on in the coming year to help make a difference where we can. So thank you. Well done. And Bill Henagan, well done on our moderating too. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.